Excellent. Welcome, everyone. I am Congressman Jared Huffman, and I'm delighted to be part of this very important program. And I want to start us off with a question. Have you noticed that American policymaking these days seems to ignore Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation between religion and government? I sure have. I'm reminded of that encroachment pretty regularly around here. So let's take the new HHS rule that legalizes discrimination by medical providers, or Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's attempts to drive more public money to religious schools. That violation of the line between church and state extends to state politics as well. This year, many of us learned for the first time about Project Blitz, a secretive campaign spearheaded by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation that's been advancing Christian legislation in state legislatures. While the ideal of religious liberty is an important part of the American story, this project is an effort to weaponize and abuse religion, and especially the term religious liberty, to allow instead for state-sanctioned discrimination, from trying to deny LGBTQ couples and individuals the opportunity to adopt a child, to restricting access to reproductive health care and abortion services, to mandating that school districts teach Bible classes, believe it or not. Project Blitz is working behind the scenes in state legislatures, and the reach of this effort is national. If you have turned on a television in the last few weeks, you have seen what's happening in the state of Alabama, and how that state government there has implemented a religiously motivated, near-universal ban on abortions. Alabama's law could be challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court, threatening Roe versus Wade, and potentially having a devastating impact nationwide. Let's be very clear, this is not about protecting religious freedom or religious liberty. It's about imposing some people's religious views on everyone else. It's about changing this pluralistic, secular democracy of ours into a theocracy, into the kind of country that is depicted in shows like The Handmaid's Tale. And many of us are just not willing to stand for that. The misuse of religion is part of what drove me to establish the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, to bring a focus to science and reason-based policy solutions, and to bring like-minded members of Congress together to promote a secular government that respects the First Amendment to the Constitution. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives is demonstrating that federal law should protect against discrimination. Last month, we approved the Equality Act, landmark legislation that expands protections of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and other civil rights laws by setting a national standard to prohibit any form of discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. While this bill has a long way to go before it can be signed into law, its passage is a historic step to protect LGBTQ Americans from legal discrimination and to continue to build on the civil rights protections that are so fundamental to our country's values. Thank you to the American Atheists for convening this important briefing, and to all of the speakers who traveled a long way to share their story and to be with us here today. Let's keep working together to protect freedom for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for being here today.
I'm going to stay as long as I can, but then I'm going to turn my microphone on too. I got to slip out here in just a minute.
Absolutely. Thank you. So today we're going to be discussing Project Blitz, which is the legislative campaign. Today we're going to be discussing Project Blitz, the types of legislation that it promotes and efforts to oppose this campaign. I'm Alison Gill. I'm the Vice President for Legal and Policy for American Atheists. And I'll begin by discussing a brief background and history for Project Blitz. Then Senator Marty from Minnesota will speak about his experiences with the Minnesota In God We Trust display bill, how he was attacked by conservative media, and how Project Blitz undermines religious freedom and also other recent developments in Minnesota. Next, Senator Juan Mendez from Arizona will speak about the In God We Trust license plate law in Arizona, how this bill was secretly used to fund hate groups in Arizona, and efforts to bring these types of license plate laws to other states. And then finally, Councilmember Grosso from the District of Columbia will speak about a resolution he sponsored recognizing Religious Freedom Day here in DC, and how we can use these measures to promote the historical American value of religious freedom as opposed to the distortion of this value we so frequently hear about. We will love to take questions from the audience. We'll do that towards the end of the presentation. And if there are media who would like to speak with one or more of the folks here as presenters, that will also be possible at the end. So I'll start with a bit of background about Project Blitz. In 2018, advocates who focus on state legislation started to see a change in the type of legislation being introduced and pushed forward in state legislatures. For example, those of us focused on church-state separation issues saw a surge in the number of bills requiring school districts to include large, 2 foot by 3 foot or so, posters saying, "In God we trust," in every classroom. So a mandate from the state that these posters have to be on every classroom wall. At the same time, LGBTQ advocates saw an increase in the number of bills creating religious exemptions which allow for discrimination in adoption and foster care. At first glance, these bills don't seem related, right? And since they affect different organizations and movements, we as advocates didn't have a reason to believe they were connected. However, we first learned about Project Blitz in 2018 through the reporting of Frederick Clarkson and others who were able to connect the dots between these various different types of bills through this campaign. These bills and many others were being jointly promoted through Project Blitz, which is a sophisticated state legislative campaign intended to attack LGBT equality, undermine the separation of religion and government, and deny access to reproductive health care. The campaign's policy agenda is centered on a distorted version of religious freedom, in which certain beliefs, for example, that same-sex marriage is illegitimate, that abortion is morally wrong, are protected and enshrined into the law at the expense of everyone else's religious equality. The campaign is designed to introduce as many bills as possible in as many states as possible in order to overwhelm the opposition. The bills pushed by this campaign are rooted in Christian nationalism, or promoting the false and ahistorical belief that America was founded as a Christian nation. This campaign has been called the ALEC of Christian nationalism. Have folks heard ALEC? Yeah. Project Blitz has 2 primary components. The first is a model policy guide with about 21 pieces of legislation, model legislation. Now, Project Blitz did not develop all these model bills themselves. Many were pre-existing and were co-opted and amplified by this campaign. For example, recent research by the Center for Public Integrity shows that nearly 550 bills introduced in 49 states over the last decade match the various bills in the model policy guide. These Project Blitz bills are also incremental. They're meant to start with easy-to-pass, low-hanging fruit bills like requiring "In God We Trust" displays in public classrooms. This allows them to build momentum and support before diving into more difficult issues like permitting discrimination. There are 3 categories within the model policy guide. The bills are grouped into 3 separate categories based on the type of opposition that they're expecting. The first category is focused on so-called religious heritage, such as bills requiring the "In God We Trust" posters in every classroom, and those requiring schools to offer Bible classes. Now, notice that both of these types of bills are focused on young people in schools, and they're also intended to promote a Christian nationalist viewpoint, sort of associating the foundation of America with Christianity. The second category focuses on resolutions and proclamations, for example, such as one promoting Christian Heritage Week or Year of the Bible. And the third category, so-called religious liberty protections, is the broadest category and the most dangerous. These include religious exemptions that allow for discrimination in specific areas like adoption and foster care, or more broadly, such as so-called Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. Bills which would lead to the denial of health care, such as religious exemptions for licensed professionals. Resolutions intended to establish public policy disfavoring same-sex marriage and promoting pseudoscientific misinformation about LGBTQ people. And efforts to encourage unconstitutional prayer in schools by teachers and others. In addition to the model bills themselves, the guide provides information about where similar bills have been passed, talking points and messaging, and other advocacy resources. It's been distributed to hundreds of state lawmakers across the country, and these lawmakers are able to work with the local resources, including local experts and state policy groups, to help lawmakers push forward these bills. There's some more in the corner over there too. The other primary component of Project Blitz is the prayer caucus, established in several different states across the country by the state legislatures. There are 32 states that have prayer caucuses, and most of these caucuses have a state director to help them push forward their agenda. These prayer caucuses are deceptive in that they claim to focus on prayer, hence the name, but they provide a mask for the true agenda of Project Blitz. They may be used to draw in more moderate or liberal lawmakers who are themselves religious or who favor religious freedom, but not the Christian Nationalist or anti-LGBTQ elements of the campaign. They don't advertise these elements. These caucuses are able to pass less controversial bills, like the In God We Trust school display bills, build relationships and experience working together, build momentum, and for more controversial bills like discriminatory religious exemptions. In some states, for example, the Bible class or In God We Trust school display laws have been introduced by Democrats and supported unanimously, since the broader agenda, the linkage to the other types of bills in containment Project Blitz are often are hidden. So let's talk a bit about statistics. Last year, there were about 75 Project Blitz type bills considered in state legislatures across the country. And this year, we're seeing about the same number, perhaps a few more. It's difficult to tell exactly which bills are directly associated with Project Blitz, since the language does vary by state, and some of these bills predate the campaign. As mentioned earlier, sometimes they're co-opted or they vary between different states. So by Project Blitz bills, we mean those bills that share language or a similar goal to those in the Model Policy Guide. Last year, about 10 Project Blitz bills passed into law, including 5 In God We Trust school display laws in Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, and Tennessee, and 3 religious exemptions in foster care and adoption bills passed in Kansas, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. We can see the effects of this campaign is having by looking at the In God We Trust display laws. In 2017, these bills were just introduced in 3 states, so 3 bills. However, in 2018, there were 26 In God We Trust bills in schools, in legislatures across the country, and as I just mentioned, 5 passed. So it's just greatly amplified where these bills are being placed and how many are passing, which, if folks track state legislation, that's a huge passage rate. Like 5 bills at a brand new issue in different states, that's a lot of bills. Notably, this year we're seeing about twice as many Bible class bills introduced, and they've passed in states like Georgia, Arkansas, and Alabama. These bills received significant attention this year when President Trump came out in favor of them. But all too often, these bills are used to solicit and promote unconstitutional proselytization in schools. And also in 2019, there were 2 In God We Trust school display bills passed in Kentucky and South Dakota. You can learn more about the types of Project Blitz bills being pushed across the country, and there's a listing of them on the blitzwatch.org site, so that's blitzwatch.org, where there's a lot of resources available and also these materials about where bills are being moved forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Marty.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here, and I want to thank American Atheists for hosting this and Congressman for his work on this. Try a different mic. Anyway, I'm electric, I guess. Anyway, I'll try and talk. Anyhow, I'm John Marty, a state senator in Minnesota, and unlike some others here perhaps, I have strong religious beliefs, and I rarely talk about them in politics. It's, okay, loudly. No, I don't have to think it, just, I'll stay back for it. I don't talk about it a lot because I'm on the ballot, and who I am and what I stand for is unavowed, not my religious beliefs. Anyway, so I rarely talk about it, but back in 2018 I had an excuse to have to talk about it because our state senate faced a proposal, in God we trust, ballot measure to put it in the public schools. I have a strong problem with that. My goodness.
I just turn it off.
Try this seat down here.
Yes, I'll try moving down.
Yeah. Because I've got
Thank you.
Musical
Thanks
chair.
for hosting us.
That's working now.
That sounds better.
Much better. Yes.
I've never had a microphone spit back at me, but anyway. But my religious beliefs are mine. They may shape what I believe and so on, but they're mine. And I highly respect the rights of others to have their beliefs or non-beliefs. I think that's important. And I think this officially sanctioned religious motto that is not the national motto since our nation's founding. E pluribus unum was the unofficial motto. But in 1956, the anti-communist era, that was decided that they added it as a national official motto. And I have problems with officially sanctioned religious beliefs. I think it stands up against the constitutional rights of freedom of conscience and stands up against our wall of separation. And so when I introduced this to put it in the public schools, the author said it would teach respect and build dignity among people and create unity. He said 79% of the people in Minnesota believe in a God, and therefore it's virtually like motherhood and apple pie. There's a broad consensus of support. So I spoke out saying I was doing so on behalf of the 21%, according to that number, that don't believe in any God, and also on behalf of many of the 79% who believe in other gods, or who believe in maybe what they might call the same God, but who don't want their religion being used to bully others. And I said it's not very welcoming to a fourth grader to have somebody come in and they have that sign on their wall. It puts the teacher in the side of the bullies. And so, when challenging the views of this, we suggested that it's not respectful and so on. I say it's more than a philosophical matter. Religious pushing like that is something where students feel that they're on their own and as people, because they're different, who are being bullied, that the school, the whole district, and everybody's behind them. When we challenged the author that believers in other religions might find this offensive too, he said, oh no, God is meant to be generic. God, with a capital G, is meant to be generic, and anybody should find it welcoming. So one of my colleagues said, well, what if we change to in Yahweh we trust, or in Allah we trust? No, that wasn't okay, because those words weren't generic. God was generic. Again, despite the capital G. What these folks are doing is using religious liberty, or the guise of religious liberty, to deny people religious liberty. In fact, one of the Christian Nationalists, Gary North, who, this is a 30-year-old quote, he says, we must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, and no neutral civil government. Then we will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God. He's very bluntly saying we're going to use religious liberty to get it for ourselves and then crush it for everybody else. And that's really offensive, and it should be. So I spoke out and said, I'd say the entire push is a bit hypocritical because I'm always surprised by how many of my colleagues in the legislature are people who say they think government is way too intrusive in our lives and we need less of it, but they want government to interfere in the most personal parts of our life. Everything from reproductive health to our religious beliefs. Project Blitz is being used as a wedge issue to split those of us who want religious and freedom and pluralism. They see it as something where they can gain political advantage by pinning their opponents down in a corner and getting votes in which they say, oh, how could you gain against apple pie or motherhood or in God we trust? For their political belief, they think this may be satisfied. It's the government is in effect sanctioning in relatively generic terms what they consider to be their religion, and that's a comforting thought. Those voters can actually show their commitment to their religion without doing anything because the government's doing it for them. I think an apparent analogy to this might be they appreciate public displays of religion just the way they appreciate public shows of patriotism. It's easier to show your patriotism by expressing outrage at NFL players who kneel during the national anthem than to get off the couch and stand up yourself when you're watching a game at home. They don't do that. That's too much work to get off the couch, but we can protest those players who are taking a knee. It's not appropriate for government to take certain religious beliefs and fiscally sanction them. Anyway, this was May of 2018, and the Sunday after the debate, the Gill's author appeared on Fox and Friends, where they smeared me and another of my colleagues for speaking against posting a motto. They described me as part of an anti-faith movement that seeks to suppress religion and wipe it out of government. They said it was a matter of religious freedom to put In God We Trust in the schools. That morning, as I said, some of those religious beliefs, I drove home from church to hear a vile, obscene phone message on my answering machine at home saying I was anti-religion. Receiving countless angry, hate-filled messages from Fox and Friends that morning is the height of irony and absurdity. Coming home from a church to be told you're anti-religious. I was going to say that I'm not anti-religious. I think I said that earlier. I have strong beliefs myself, and I respect religious beliefs of others. My father is a renowned theologian. I'm the great-grandson of a Lutheran minister. I actually said this on Fox and Friends. Great-grandson of a Lutheran minister, the grandson of one, the son of one, the brother of one, and the father of a daughter who's a Lutheran minister. I take my faith seriously, and it's my business, not somebody else's. As is your faith or non-faith, your business, not somebody else's. And I think that having a government sanction model actually demeans and devalues the religious beliefs of those who have sincere beliefs. So despite the fact that I figured it wasn't a fair shake, I agreed to go on a debate on Fox and Friends the next day and defended the integrity of my faith and my opposition in God We Trust. I told them that I found In God We Trust posting to be offensive to me, and it should be offensive to both believers and non-religious and non-religious. Speaking as a Christian, government-sanctioned motto doesn't strengthen any religion, it demeans and devalues it. I don't want my religious beliefs watered down by simplistic, generic, politically motivated sanctioned mottos. My faith teaches a radical respect and love for others, welcoming refugees, showing compassion to those who are hurting. It does not advocate for using one's religion to bully others. We certainly need to stand together as there are targets of discrimination and oppression. It takes courage and commitment. And I'd say there's an extra onus of those of us who are people of faith to speak out in opposition to this Christian nationalist movement. When those who speak out, we have the potential to change minds. I had one call from somebody in Maryland or somebody after the Fox and Friends thing saying he heard about what I had done on Sunday and was just angry as could be at me. And he listened to what I had on Monday, and he said, I agreed with everything you said. So one person was converted. But the point is, we have too much of this, and Project Blitz is really a harmful movement. And for those who don't think it's a big deal because they're not into this, whether it's officially sanctioned religious mottos or not, look at the whole Project Blitz agenda. When I see what's happening, it's the same part of the anti-gay, anti-reproductive choice agenda. 15 years ago, Michelle Bachmann was a colleague of mine in the state Senate, and she started pushing her anti-gay marriage thing with constitutional amendment. Because I was one of 5 members of our Judiciary Committee that blocked it from passing, I was receiving mountains of hate mail, most of it religiously based, saying we can't do this, this is evil, and so on. How dare you call yourself a religious person when you disagree with this? And so I think we have to keep speaking out on that. And I want to say that this keeps popping up, and you don't know, they're very good at hiding things. This year we had a huge debate in Minnesota because our budget for our Minnesota Historical Society, a private nonprofit, it's our state official historical society, gets state appropriations, and the Republican Senate majority was proposing to cut it by enough that we'd be laying off 20% of the employees every state historic site around the state. When we asked them why you're doing this, we expected the answer, well, budgets are tough, we gotta do this, so we have a budget surplus. In the end, the author of the bill said, well, we didn't want to fund them appropriately, fully because of the controversy. What controversy? It's a secret. I said, a secret controversy? And one of our other colleagues finally explained, well, actually they were upset because the Historical Society was rewriting history in their mind, revisionist history on things. And we had a long fight. It was only because the governor of the House that they didn't get any cut. And then in preparing for this, I found out that somebody from Americans United for Separation of Church and State at Oregon, Prof, was invited to speak at a non-profit Minnesota Historical Society event. He's a scholar on religious liberty, and he wanted to speak on, he was speaking on the myth of our Christian founding. He was saying that historically that's not what we were founded as. And the Minnesota Prayer Caucus, which relates to the Congressional Prayer Caucus, they actually wrote threatening letters to the Historical Society. If you don't cancel this speaker, we might just cut your budget. We didn't even know about that till after the fact, but it's again a very right-wing thing saying, we want it our way. We can have religious freedom, just agree with me and you'll be free to do whatever you want. But if you disagree, we're gonna crush it. So I think it's very important we do that, and I want to thank American Atheists and others for helping make this possible.
Thank you so much, Senator. Senator Mendez.
Thank you. I also want to thank the American Atheists for helping putting this on, and for the Free Thought Caucus for inviting me, for inviting us here, having us all here. Again, my name is Juan Mendez. I am a state senator from Arizona. Just started my second term as a senator. I did 2 terms in the House. I also happen to be an atheist. The license plate situation that I'm going to speak on is not my first experience in speaking out against attacks on the separation of religion and state. As a state, Arizona suffers from multiple entities and their efforts to impose their religious views on our secular government under the guise of trying to get their motto into as many public places as possible. These organizations all have different framing, but share the goal of getting religious messages in the front of many eyes as possible, no matter the age, and to legitimize this practice through public sponsorship and endorsement by our secular government. For me, what started out as an honest question from a constituent about what he was funding when he purchased a public license plate uncovered a nationwide campaign sponsored by different but organized Christian nationalist movements to further undermine the separation of religion and government, to attack LGBTQ equality and reduce access to reproductive health care. These organizations and their campaigns are based in fear. They fear irrelevance and their weakening hold over cultural norms. They see a secular government as an attack on their identity because the state isn't sponsoring their view of history. Thus, they think we're poisoning our citizens. Without government-sponsored proselytizing, they frame our secular process as a lessening of their grip over the various policy concerns we all face. They believe their model legislation is an attempt to reshape history and, moreover, protect their religious convictions. However, these attempts are nothing more than state policies in favor of biblical values concerning marriage and sexuality. After I introduced legislation to address these attacks on secular government, they then went to the media and my constituents to accuse me of attacking their religious freedoms and their right to express themselves by framing my legislation as an attempt to discriminate against all religions. As a result, I received numerous pieces of hate mail, messages, and voicemails accusing me of not understanding the First Amendment and of hating all religions. Because over a decade ago, the legislation establishing a license plate in Arizona, stating "In God We Trust," passed as a floor amendment with no discussion, no debate, and no explanation. Void of public disclosure, discourse, or transparency, people who choose this license plate never know that they are sending their money to a recognized hate group. It was not stated at the DMV or online. It wasn't even stated in the statute to establish a plate. It's just nowhere. So since 2008, the Alliance for Defending Freedom to Hate, as I like to call it, has received funding from Arizona to purchase this specialty plate. Almost $1 million of public money has been funneled into this hate group. Again, neither the text of the law or our Department of Transportation indicates that $17 fee from each purchase funds ADF. To me, it doesn't matter that their annual operating budget is over $50 million. Any public money is still too much because it empowers them to focus on their more sinister projects. ADF recently represented Colorado baker Jack Phillips in the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, a case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in a very narrow 7-2 decision. This year, in my own state, the Arizona Supreme Court heard from ADF during oral arguments in the organization's lawsuit representing Brush and Nib Studio, the Phoenix Studio's Christian owners who believe a 2013 city ordinance banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation violates their rights under the law. because under the law, Brush and Nib must create wedding invitations for LGBTQ couples. Lower courts in Arizona ruled against the artists and found the Phoenix ordinance does not violate the artist's free First Amendment rights. But while the ADF has made these court fights part of its mission, that means Arizonans who buy the specialty plates are inadvertently bankrolling the group's high-stakes legal battles. State dollars should not be funding an organization that works to strip our residents of their human rights and dignity under the guise of religious freedom. This should not be an American value, even if you believe the founding fathers of the nation wanted you to be able to discriminate based on your beliefs. Further, very few realize that the license plate law funding ADF fits into a larger, dangerous Christian Nationalist legislative campaign called Project Blitz, which we've gone over. It's because these organizations are passing these seemingly innocuous bills in the hopes of building enough momentum to pass other anti-equality legislation. Even after learning about how the license plate program works and how their specific plate was created, proponents still didn't care. They continued to view their government license plate as the equivalent of a bumper sticker, and deflected from their egregious views by proposing I create my own license plate with my own message. In fact, the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee in Arizona, a Republican, publicly stated that he would go out as soon as he could to get one of these license plates after having learning about its history and how it funds a hate group. It's one thing to have a bumper sticker, it's another to have a state-sanctioned billboard that diverts a cut of the proceeds to a hate group. This is a blatant attack on the separation of religion and state. We can't build a tolerant and diverse society by adding government-sponsored hate speech on countless moving billboards. So I worked with the community to bring new transparency requirements, requiring our Department of Transportation to establish a database listing the sales of each specialty plate, the entity receiving the revenue, and the annual sum generated by each plate. I also sponsored a separate legislation to end the In God We Trust plate with the caveat that it could start over again, but this time through the traditional committee process, the public input, and the full disclosure of the attempt to fund a hate group that openly supports the recriminalization of homosexuality in the US and criminalization abroad. They defend state-sanctioned sterilization of trans people abroad. They link homosexuality to pedophilia. They claim that the homosexual agenda will destroy Christianity and society. They work to develop religious liberty legislation and case law to allow the denial of goods and services to LGBTQ people on the basis of religion, such as we've seen in Arizona with the Brush and Nib case. They also knowingly propagate falsehoods about LGBTQ people, challenge laws that protect the rights of these people, and advocate for restricted access to reproductive health care. So after having come out as a gay man to his father, my constituent Johnny Martin then had to confront his family over their choice of this license plate. Mr. Martin stated it was hurtful to find out that a message that he would otherwise feel comforted by, or comfortable with or comforted by, funds these groups. Now he sees that this is literally just a funding mechanism for an organization that already has a ton of money, and it doesn't need to go about this in such a shady way. Mr. Martin has been involved in advocacy for expanding non-discrimination protections in our state, and after educating his family, they agreed that having this plate was a problem. So after they learned what it did, they made changes. He cautions jumping to conclusions when seeing this plate on someone else's car because many drivers like his father just didn't know where the funds were going. Yet he found it frustrating that the state would support efforts to fund religious groups that aim to have certain groups lose their rights. After deciding I wasn't going to be able to get my bills to move in committee, I organized with the local nonprofit, the Secular Arizona Coalition, who partnered with the American Atheists to erect billboards in Phoenix and Tucson that alert Arizonans to the truth about where their money is going. I then requested a meeting with our Department of Transportation where I was relieved to find out that they were already following the situation and decided to implement transparency measures on their own. While half the battle is achieved, we still need reasonable criteria for deciding which organizations the state sends money to. And a legitimate starting point is that we shouldn't include these Project Blitz hate groups. Not another public dollar should make its way into their hateful hands. And now I'm bringing my findings and case to you because the campaign that is attacking secular government in Arizona is supported by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, an organization that we're all familiar with. I believe a secular government should not be used to promote any religious views, especially hate. The whole license plate program is a scam in Arizona. Anybody with money can create a license plate and then use the government to help them raise money. Third-party organizations with their own agenda should not be able to use the government to endorse their views and help them raise money. This specific license plate was not created in good faith. They created a license plate with no discussion and no disclosure on who would be receiving these funds. And so, we're just doing what we can to bring light to this issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Senator. Councilmember Grosso?
Thank you, Alison, and good afternoon, everybody. I am David Grosso. I'm an at-large council member here in the District of Columbia, which means that I represent the whole city. We have districts, but I'm one of the at-large members. And although DC is not yet a state, which we actually should be, we have responsibilities of a mix of state, legislature, county commissioner, as well as a local council. And so there's a lot of responsibilities. And while Project Blitz is unlikely to gain much traction here in the District of Columbia, given our political makeup, I wanted to support the effort to push back on their promotion of hate and discrimination. There is strong, unanimous support on the DC Council and with the mayor and all the political leaders in the city for the rights of women, LGBTQ people, and religious minorities. And usually it is Congress, these folks that work here, that try to undermine our efforts and try to impose discrimination on the people of the District of Columbia. So I felt an obligation to take action and remind people of the origins of the freedom of religious protections in our Constitution. And last January, I authored and the Council unanimously approved the Religious Freedom Day Recognition Resolution of 2019. This resolution commemorates the anniversary of January 16, 1786, which was when there was the enactment of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The statute guaranteed freedom of religion, including freedom from religion, for the people of Virginia, and it served as the forerunner for the approach to religion and government taken by the framers of our Constitution, which, as you know, provides similar protections. These principles are not only foundational, but remain essential to the health and future of our democracy. The simple truth is that the government cannot favor one religion over another or over non-religion without fatally undermining religious freedom as a whole. These days, the concept of freedom of religion is under attack with certain special interest groups and leaders who want to turn the original idea on its head and advance the ideas of the United States as a Christian and solely Christian country. As we have seen, those pushing this agenda are trying to turn freedom of religion into freedom to discriminate, whether demeaning our LGBTQ neighbors, attacking reproductive health freedoms and women's rights more broadly, or demonizing Muslims and fanning the flames of anti-Semitism. As a legislative body in a jurisdiction with no tolerance for intolerance, my colleagues on the council and I must remain vigilant and stand with our friends and families in other places against efforts to redefine religious freedom as religious oppression. After approving the resolution, we presented it to the community with the support of groups like the Interfaith Alliance and the Interfaith Council of Metro Washington. I think that a resolution like this can be helpful in reminding everyone of the historic value of religious freedom as opposed to the distorted concept that is used to justify harmful policies like those coming from Project Blitz. While often people get focused on the national scene, particularly here in the District of Columbia, it is so important that we set the tone of acceptance and love and true religious freedom at the local level too. Hopefully our actions here can help make that happen. In the District of Columbia, we have a great diversity of people of faith, including people of no faith, and our residents have long supported freedom of religion in its truest sense, ranging from non-discrimination policies covering LGBTQ individuals to broad access to abortion. I hope that you can also continue to stand with the District of Columbia and help to end our disenfranchisement by stopping attacks by Congress or the presidential administration on our religious freedom and rights, as well as by supporting greater autonomy for us and eventually statehood. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a good amount of time for questions. So if you have any questions for our fantastic panelists, raise your hand. I see one right there, yes.
So I just kind of want to clarify something in my head. So pretty much you're basically saying, well not basically saying, but are you pretty much assuming that the Colorado like wedding cake case after that 7-2 decision that you brought up, and like the Republican majority in our judiciary is pretty much leading way to all of this religious, freedom of religion bills and laws that are more so freedom to discriminate and whatnot.
So I don't think the Colorado case is related directly to Project Blitz anyway. I think it was being used as an example of overreach, but I don't think, we're not saying it's related to Project Blitz as far as I'm aware. But Senator?
I brought that case up to state that the license plate bill is funding ADF, and ADF goes out to then start these cases. So it's kind of connected.
Do you think that these bills are, in a way, form of judicial activism or impact litigation that is meant to push lawsuits through the state courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court in a way to challenge the establishment clause?
I do in some areas, especially when it comes to schools. For example, the display bills in schools, and also the Bible class bills. Now, the courts and Supreme Court has laid out very specific rules that Bible classes, classes about the Bible must meet in order to be taught in schools and be constitutional. And those are very hard to meet. It's very difficult because they have to do it in a way that's not, must be secular. It must be taught to, and it's as basically literature, right, or education, not as promoting a religion. So it's difficult to do, and some of these bills are pushing further and further, giving teachers more freedom and less accountability when they do not follow that line. So I think there's definitely just two examples, some ways where this could be used to push against the establishment clause.
I think also, Alison, just, I think it's important to remember that there isn't necessarily an ulterior motive here. I think people are pushing an agenda that they believe in, that they think is the right way to go in our country, which is to make it recognize that the religion as the Christian religion as the official religion, et cetera, and I think you see that most obviously in some of the administration's policies. Certainly Secretary DeVos and the work that she's done, almost across the board, investing in policies that really undermine the openness of our public education system and the willingness to educate everybody equally. And I think that's probably important to remember as well.
I believe they're not going to end with these like innocuous sounding bills. They argue, that it's just a motto in the schools. It's just a motto on a license plate. Like, get over it. But they're trying to set the stage for a more bigger takeover and to then go after other people's rights.
One of the bills in Alabama, for example, that just passed allows for display in conjunction with these Bible classes of other materials besides just In God We Trust, for a display of religious texts, for example, which is has specific.
See, there's a lot of things. How about we right there?
Has the increase of the bills and the activism propagated by Project Blitz have any relation to the rise of domestic terrorism and extremism seen in this country?
I don't know if I connected it to terrorism, but I would definitely connect it to the emboldenment of just the people out and about who want to start pushing their views on everybody else. So, I imagine we're going to get more and more companies who are looking for cases so they don't have to serve certain people.
And clearly, it's being used to divide, to build the anger. The calls I got on my home answering machine, hateful calls, how I hate religion, I hate this and so on, which was very ironic, as I said, but you don't treat people that way. I was going to say, it teaches people, the author of the bill in Minnesota was saying this is to build respect and it would unite us. I said, well, 38 to 20 something vote isn't uniting us, it's dividing us, and it's intentionally doing that. I think that a lot of this, we've got to be careful with saying what causes terrorism, but it's clearly preaching division between people, and I think it's very troubling because of that. I think it's anti-religious, it's anti-civic good, it's anti-caring about others. It's designed to divide, and I don't know that it causes terrorism, but it's certainly not helping create understanding.
And along this idea of drawing a line, to me it feels like a kind of oppression where they're almost daring me to speak out against it. Like they're trying to create this division. They want me to have to either be quiet or not express who I am.
The senators bring up great points. I mean, I think we're calling that faith baiting, where basically they try to label opponents of these types of bills, in God We Trust in schools display bills, for example, or Bible class bills, as being anti-religious, as happened with Senator Marty, and then use that against him electorally, which, you know, is dividing people on the basis of religion unfairly.
There's one way in the back there.
Keeping that in mind and with the growing division in our country under the current administration, what do you think the next steps are in combating this project?
Well, hopefully this is one of the next steps in raising awareness about Project Blitz. I feel like most folks still have never heard of it, and including most state lawmakers, where it's most important that they are aware of it, because, as I said before, these prayer caucuses can be deceptive, and, you know, prayer caucus sounds innocuous, right? And people might join that because they are religious or support religious freedom, and then find themselves inadvertently supporting this agenda. So I think awareness is a really important thing we can do to sort of combat Project Blitz. Also, I mean, if you are a lawmaker or your lawmaker is a member of the Congressional Prayer Caucus or a state prayer caucus, you know, it's possible to leave that organization or withdraw from it because they are being used to promote harmful bills, often without your knowledge. Another great step that we, you know, that the Councilmember and also Senator Marty took is to introduce positive resolutions to talk about the historical nature of religious freedom. And I think that can be done in counties and states and legislatures all over the country to talk about Religious Freedom Day, where our values originated from, the Virginia statute. I think those are all really important steps so that the narrative of religious freedom is not co-opted by Project Blitz.
And in addition to resolutions, we actually, in my office, we're proactively trying to pass anti-discrimination laws all the time that expand the protections for more and more people in our city. Partly because I think it's the right thing to do, but partly because I'm trying to push the battle lines out further and further away from basic rights of human beings and the protections that we have. And that is something that we're working, for example, right now on abortion protection law, something that will expand protection for abortion in the District of Columbia to try to keep the battle out there away from actually eroding the rights of a woman to choose.
And I want to add to that, I think the council members think passing that resolution on religious liberty does educate people. Yeah, ours was introduced the same thing for January 16th, I think, which is the anniversary of the religious liberty law passed in Virginia 300 years ago. It was a very powerful law, and it's the nation's founders, which again, these folks are trying to co-opt them and say that they were for this because a lot of them had a belief in a God, that therefore that they intended our nation to be that way, and the Constitution is being twisted that way, and I think, don't forget that quote from this religious nationalist where he said, literally, we must use the doctrine of religious liberty to do so and so. Then we can do this and deny the religious liberty of the enemies of God. Because we want religious liberty for us, and then they're openly saying, not many will openly say it, but then we want to take away religious liberty for others. And I think the first thing you have to do is expose it. That's why American Atheists wanted to do this for congressional staffs and so on, and to make sure more people are aware of it, and so we can challenge the Congressional Prayer Caucus and State Prayer Caucus are supposed to sound to the voters like motherhood and apple pie. Oh, everybody should join that. It's a good thing because the majority of people might like that, but you got to stand up and say that's a gross distortion of reality.
I'll also say that you don't even have to go all the way back, several years ago. The Project Blitz policy guide itself talks about how the bills are meant to basically only support their religious perspective. Like the way that the First Amendment Defense Act, they have a different name in the booklet, but they basically talk about how it's written in such ways that only protect their beliefs about marriage and how it should be, not same-sex marriage allowed. And so that's specifically framed, and that's just one issue. There's several others that they talk about how, we could make this more generic, but that might protect other religious viewpoints. So, I mean, it's very, very explicit who they want to protect and who actually should get religious liberty.
Oh, in the back there.
I had a question. My question was, do you think that there's any possibilities of there being major court wins against efforts synonymous with Project Blitz, especially considering that recently the Supreme Court refused to hear a case against "In God We Trust" being inscribed on our currency?
I think it does depend on the issue area. For example, there was just a great court win in Michigan relating to the adoption and foster care exception there. So I think that depends on Project Blitz, as I mentioned, is a broad. It has 21 bills that are across a wide variety of issues, and so you can't say with any specific, specificity about where court wins might come. But that's one great example of how they're trying to push forward bills that, the courts are balking out.
Well, I don't want to predict what the courts are going to do, but I do think we have to hope our courts are going to keep promoting what the First Amendment's about. And I think, I hope that in the long term it will. I'm not so sure I'm very confident in the court right now.
Right here in front.
Hi, I'm Naomi Washington Marty, and I'm the faith director at the National LGBTQ Task Force, which co-sponsored this, and we've been working with Alison and others, to do exactly what you all have said. And I just wanted to name, to the question about what can we do about this, I think one layer of public education has to be done kind of within faith communities themselves, right? So because part of why this is so resonant, as you said, is because it sounds so innocuous. It sounds so kind of critical to people's core identities, and they get misunderstandings from faith communities themselves. And so one of the things that we've been doing at the task force is trying to talk to religious leaders themselves about how they can educate their members about what's going on, and also about how they can teach differently from even a theological perspective about what faith gives us the freedom to do in civil and public society, right? So we've been doing that, talking directly to faith leaders themselves. So between educating our lawmakers and educating our faith leaders, we might get some movement on this.
And related to that, I mean, when we had a constitutional amendment, again, Michelle Bachmann was pushing a constitutional amendment in Minnesota to ban same-sex marriages back then. It was against the law, and they wanted to codify it and put it in the Constitution. And I think that we work very aggressively with the faith community to try and do the education, as you said. And that is the majority of people in the country are parts of some faith community or another, very diverse range of things. But you don't want to say, hey, because it's not anti-faith, this is religious liberty we're pushing. And the right of people to have no faith or some faith. And the whole thing, I mean, members of Congress have to be concerned about all their constituents. They should be concerned about all, not about some percentage of them. And so I think your point is exactly right. We have to work with faith communities and with the atheist community and everybody to try and recognize that the nation's founders had a brilliant idea that we respect people's conscience.
Thank you. Question over here?
So I'm trying to think strategically about legislation moving forward, and you've mentioned a couple examples in your different jurisdictions. You have creating a day of observation. Senator Mendez, I know you were trying to proactively create transparency laws. I'm wondering if you have your eye or any ideas on types of legislation that you may be able to pass that would sort of cut the soft at the knees.
That is a great question. You're talking about the federal level.
Either.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I think there's lots of Councilmember Grosso was talking about proactive legislation to protect people and prohibit discrimination. I think that's a great example. But also at the federal level, I think we want to call attention to the Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which is introduced recently by Congressman Lewis in the House, and is a really important piece of legislation which would protect people from discrimination in foster care and adoption services. So that provides protection on the basis of religion as well as sexual orientation, gender identity, and marital status. So that's, especially when it comes to these bills about religious exceptions in foster care adoption, that's incredibly important.
I think it's important also when you're drafting legislation, no matter what the topic, if there's data collection involved or if there's some rights involved, to make sure you're totally inclusive of everybody. So we include the entire LGBTQ community, include everybody in the collection of the data, whatever it is. It might seem innocuous, but the more that you can get it in, so for example, we changed regularly the YRBS data that's collected, which is every 2 years. We're allowed to add questions. It's a federal survey of youth in the city. And the questions that we've pushed in my office to add include asking directly about LGBT youth's experience about bullying or any kind of issues that they have in the schools, which is pretty unique, but is important to get that ingrained in the kind of the base of all of these programs, which will make it harder for them to root it out in the future.
I'll say, if you have any suggestions on how we can proactively cut this off, I welcome them, I think we all would. But the other thing is, again, just letting people know. The more they realize this is not a motherhood and apple pie, we all agree with it, and well, you shouldn't object, oh, why bother with that? The more you can let them see what's going on here, and how they're trying to twist our foundational documents in a way to promote their interests. Again, the idea that somebody wants to say, we're for religious liberty for us, but we're going to crush those other folks. And that's really offensive. And so I think educating people, that's why this whole forum today, make sure we educate people and make sure, because we don't even know what they're doing against us. It's kind of hard to fight it.
Another thing that we're taking advantage of all this opportunity to just reclaim where a lot of us are coming from, especially on the atheist side. And so we took advantage of this opportunity to build a coalition with a lot of the interfaith groups, so that we are, more accepted and part of, I guess, society, so that we won't be able to get attacked in the future, or if they do attack us, they'll be attacking everybody else.
I think I'll take one more question in the back there, yes?
Yeah, I was just wanted to clarify whether it was ALEC that it's mainly pushing these bills in state legislatures, or there are other organizations involved in it. And I also wanted to know if any of you knew who funds ALEC, as well as any other organizations involved in it.
Sure, it's actually not ALEC. I was using ALEC as an example of this type of thing. And there's been a lot of media attention to these types of programs before, where they basically take state legislation and copy them from state to state to state to get different people to introduce them. ALEC is an example that many people are familiar with. But this is Project Blitz's own example of this sort of program. So Project Blitz is the program itself. It's sponsored by, according to the Model Policy Guide, three organizations: the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, Wall Builders, and also the National Legal Foundation. So that's who are the organizations involved. And just as a brief description, Wall Builders, according to their mission, seeks to educate the nation concerning the godly foundation of our country. Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation seeks to preserve America's Judeo-Christian heritage. And that was originally established by the Congressional Prayer Caucus in 2005. And then the National Legal Foundation, which agrees that the Bible, perhaps even more than the Constitution, is our nation's founding document.
I'll add to that ALEC is funded by corporate money because they're pushing the corporate agenda. Project Blitz is funded by a number of people, very wealthy, who have a very right-wing social view, and they want to push it on others. And I want to say that, Senator, your thing is so important. It's taking away the idea that your fellow citizens are paying money for license plates and it's going to a right-wing group. I mean, I just think it's offensive that nobody knows about that, and so I really want to applaud what you're doing to fight that.
Thank you.
Well, that is our time. I want to thank everybody for coming, and we will stick around for a few minutes to answer any questions or chat, and of course we'll be available to media. Thank you all so much.